but let's go ahead and get this thing shared and set up and hopefully do it right this time. Okay, so we'll stop the share briefly, pause the recording while I zoom the recording and get this thing going for the students at home. Now, this is one of those lectures where history catches up to us, right? So we have to do something we hadn't planned early this morning, but we have to change gears just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I share the screen here, is let's finish up where we were last time, and that's let's wrap up this discussion of the economy, right? So let's get that finished, and then that won't take us very long, and then we're going to do the other thing. Now, here's the problem we've got. We talked about what happens when we get to full employment, right? I mean, isn't that kind of where we left it, right? Okay, when has the United States also suffered labor shortages, and how have we dealt with them in history? Yes. Yeah, that's a great example. So we basically hired hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to come up and rescue the almost abandoned agricultural industry in California and Texas and Arizona, and the railroads too in the West that were not, we didn't have enough people to manage the railroads. Okay, so that becomes kind of an important one, all right?
Storm the Capitol.
Okay, let's go through here. Okay, so there we go. All right, so that's one. Okay, give me another instance. When have we had labor shortages where we just needed more workers to grow the economy? Look, if you got a great business idea, you set up a little manufacturing operation, and you can't hire anybody to do the work, you're in trouble, right? I mean, it's just very simple.
There are things in the earliest days of involving the indentured servitude. So
Yeah, you nailed it. It starts early. In 1607, the British landed in Jamestown, and they struggled for a few years, but they find by 1613, they found a product that they could grow and make a lot of money on. And what was it called? Tobacco. Europe was hungry for tobacco. The Europeans loved taking those leaves, turning them into cigarettes, and turning them into pipe tobacco and chewing tobacco and all that kind of stuff. That's stuff that I hope you guys don't have no contact with in your lives. But by the same token, it was a huge, very profitable business. And then we would expand the cotton into sugar, right? And both of those are even more demanding. It's hard, laborious work. The first effort was indentured servants, where you take a bunch of poor people or people in legal trouble in England, and you bring them here for 7 years. They sign a contract. We're going to do, basically work like slaves. And at the end of that, you'll get 40 acres and you can go and start your own life, and it's the American dream from there on, right? If you survive the 7 years. But nevertheless, it's called indentured servitude. That didn't do it. They couldn't get enough. So in come a Dutch ship in 16, you remember the year? Zimbabwe points. Or anybody can give me the year? No, they came in 1607 was the first arrival of the English. 13 was the tobacco discovery. Close. Yeah, it was 1619. That's kind of an important date. 1619, a Dutch ship comes in with some slaves that they had stolen from a Spanish ship and sell them for profit. And oh, guess what? They decided to solve the labor shortage that way. So for the next 150 so years, the United States then grew into the largest, #1, biggest slave-owning society in the world. In terms, we had more slaves than any other country. It's hard, backbreaking work, all of it. And by the way, slaves, while expensive to buy at the initial stages, if they last long enough, they're going to more than pay for themselves and make you very, very rich on your plantation. Just ask George Washington about that. Ask Thomas Jefferson about that. Ask James Madison about that.
Many of the founding fathers were slave owners.
They were all slave owners, with the exceptions of the Adamses. So here's the deal. That was the first time. Now, later in history, after the Civil War and slavery was no longer an option, then what happened? What next thing? Going to get some automation, yes, in the industrial what? Revolution. But those factories required lots of workers because the automation wasn't what it is today, right? So they still require lots of workers. So those factories, right? How do you fill the factories? Immigration from Europe, mainly on the East Coast, We're talking from Poland, we're talking from Italy, we're talking from Eastern Europe mainly at this particular stage in history. Before that though, remember Lincoln's Transcontinental Railroad? How did they get that built? The Central Pacific hired Chinese workers to come over, and the Union Pacific hired Irish immigrants to come over, and they built the railroad, which transformed the economy. Now, none of those people are leaving, they're now part of the country, right? So we solved it through immigration. Massive, massive immigration. That's why we got the Statue of Liberty. That's why we said, bring us your tired, you're poor, you're hungry. Why? Because guess what? If you're earning breathe free, we got a factory job just for you. And it was during that time period of the most extensive immigration into this country of any time period that we filled our factories. And we became, during that same time period, the #1 manufacturing country in the world. Now, we weren't 51%, we were maybe 20. Germany was doing great, and they were maybe 18, and England was maybe 14, and France 13, and so it was more spread out, Japan. But by the same token, we now were an economic power. We weren't a diplomatic power, we weren't a military power, but we were definitely an economic power because of immigration. Now we're facing what? The next labor shortage. And there's only 3 ways out of it, and you gave us the one way, automation. So let's replace people with machines. Why do you think the Japanese auto industry won?
They didn't have the population to keep up with everyone, so they had to automate it.
When I saw the first pictures of a Japanese manufacturing facility making cars, and you had these huge robots moving that thing through the assembly line. Look, Americans say, oh no, we make it ourselves, handcrafted. Okay, look, humans make too many mistakes. Robots, they get it right every time, and if they do make a mistake, it's the programmer's fault, right? Or it's a faulty little piece of equipment, so they go fix that. But the truth of the matter is the nature of jobs changed. And suddenly we had a labor shortage. Now with labor shortages, guess what? You can solve it with automation, and that's what they did. Let me give you some examples. When I was growing up, the biggest industry in Utah was the copper mine. Yeah, 5,000 employees. If you graduated high school, lived in my neighborhood, you could walk up to the copper mine and get a really good paying job. There's no minimum wage being paid there. Yeah, now they do more with half the staff because of automation. The revelation to me hit home when I went on a tour of a Budweiser brewing plant in Colorado. I was off doing a triathlon, and part of the thing was a tour of different places in the city. So we go there and look at this plant. I was stunned because what I expected to see was a bunch of workers, and I hope, like I said, these notes are important. I'm sure they are. But here's the thing. I expect a lot of people running around duking, making the beer. I only saw 2 people working the entire shift. 2, as we toured the plant. One was the brewmaster. See, they had these huge vats where they brew the beer. They truck in all the hops and the grain and everything that's needed, and they got the water tanks and whatever. And these tanks, right? At that point, they still had to scrub the tanks after a full batch was done. So there was a few people involved in that. But then when they start filling these tanks and they put in the hops and they put in all this wood and the stuff they do, it's really complicated. All of this is automated. And then it brews. And when it's ready, a computer goes off and said, that tank is ready. The brewmaster, the only guy I saw working that day, well, 1 of 2, he would taste it, make sure, yep, this is what we're looking for. This is Coors Light. And all of a sudden it started to fill cans all over the facility, and tens of thousands of cans are working their way through. Not a human touching them at all. By the way, that's good for sanitation too. And as a result, they filled all these cans with this beer. And then the one guy working was the guy that was making sure 2 long chutes were filled with lids and that they never run out. And that still had to be, he had to take them and undo the plastic and slide them down there. And these lids, boom, 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 boom. The cans were then sealed. They were then taken to another ramp, which was put into cartons, and the cartons were put into cases, and the cases were taken down, all automated, no humans involved, down to the dock where they were loaded into trucks. And they can do water there, they can do soda pop, they can do any kind of drink at all, and guess what? The profit margins are probably 95%. And I'm going, where are the workers? Oh, we employ a few hundred. What? And the millions of dollars you're making from that plant, and it's only a few hundred people that are even working it, and that most of those are night guards. Yeah, comment.
But the main automation that is, I would say, is the intelligence.
AI, and we're going to talk all about AI later in the semester, because if you think this type of automation is a big deal, wait for the AI. And you're 10,000% right there, and I'm saving that for another day because of what's happening in Afghanistan. So thank you. Don't forget AI, because we've only seen the tip of the iceberg here. So the question is, well, there's still jobs that need to be done, right? If we have a labor shortage, how are we going to deal with it? Well, we're in the middle of one. As this unemployment rate that we drew up here on the board starts to go down, guess what? Prices going to go up. Here we go. Let's show you.
Well, maybe you've noticed lately, grocery prices are soaring. Stephanie Rule now with some ways to save.
You can't miss it. Cheese and stuff that we try to stay away because the prices have gone up. Sticker shock in the supermarket aisle. John Camarage says his grocery bill has nearly doubled.
Are you buying less fresh food, less produce, less meat because of the prices?
It's more produce than meat to us, because meat is very expensive.
Compared to a year ago, many staples will cost more. A dozen eggs and a pound of ground chuck both up 7%, and a loaf of bread up 11%.
I would expect that we're going to see prices continue to rise over the next 6 to 18 months.
Experts say that's because of the supply, coupled with the increased cost of getting products onto shelves. Factors include rising gas prices, driver shortages, fewer workers in meatpacking plants and bakeries, and bad winter weather that.
So let's take a look at the factors. Gas prices are going up. Why? Because the COVID restrictions are dropping, people are traveling more, gas prices are going to go up, supply and demand. So the people that are shipping stuff have to pay more. Second, driver shortages. They can't get enough drivers. I cannot believe how many companies now are into delivery, every from DoorDash to Amazon to, Domino's announced that they're going to now start a delivery service in Texas for Domino's Pizza, which used to be a minimum wage job for some high school kid getting his way through school. And they're going to do it all with driverless cars. Amazon, to defeat this gas price thing, announced just a few days ago, they're buying 100,000 electric vehicles. Because they're betting that the price of electric will be cheaper over the long run than the price of gasoline. And oh, by the way, less workers. How many like Chick-fil-A? Now, I think I explained this to this class, right? Didn't I explain to you that the most profitable franchises in America right now are Chick-fil-A? The average franchise will make, or the average franchise, $4 million a year. The owner operator, you guys don't take fast food lightly, man. Don't take restaurants lightly. It's a great way to make money. It's an amazing business. You got to just get the skills for it. But the average owner operator could make up to $400,000 a year if you can get a franchise. A year. Plus, it's great employment for a lot of the youth and things like that. And by the way, they don't pay just minimum wage. They can't. St. George, we got, I think it was, what was it that In-N-Out started paying $10 an hour, now 12, and everybody else got to raise their prices too. So I don't worry about minimum wage. I don't care. They never changed minimum wage again. Shortage in workers will raise those prices up. I told you about Amazon, where it went to $15 an hour. And all of the area that they hire from, all those jobs went up 4% in terms of pay. So while this right here, let's look at the meatpacking plants. You want Chick-fil-A chicken? Well, you better man those chicken plants. And guess what? I've done that work. It's hard work. Taking and segmenting chickens for nuggets is not an easy task. And it's a little hard to automate, although they've done some automation, but it's just, the truth of the matter is, where are we going to get the workers to do that work? And then let's look at roofing. I gave you the example of roofing, right? Where the guy, big developer in our area told me, he said they would have a crew up there doing a roof, reach an agreement, how much to pay them, paying them a lot more these days, that's a great way to make money. Roofing right now is a great high paying job. Another company would drive up while they're on the roof working and say, how much are you being paid for this job? We'll double it if you come and bail us out because we just lost our roofers here and we got to finish this because the new owner is going to move in on Thursday and we don't have a roof up for him. That's what happened to us. We had a roof partially torn off by one crew and they decided to go to Florida. So then what are we going to do? Bear with all winter? So they went out and hired this crew from Guatemala at a higher price. Boy, did they do a job. We're so glad we got them. But it cost more money. Capitalism. And when you have a labor shortage, you got to fill it somehow. And the only ways to do it are immigration, automation, or increase your birth rate dramatically, which isn't going to happen in this country. It's continuing to decline. Germany is continuing to decline. Where we would pull kids from the farm and immigrants to go into those factories in the Industrial Revolution, China has an inexhaustible supply of poor people. India too. That's why they can scale bigger than we can.
Realistically, in this terms of that, we can get third best economy based on our
In terms of overall GDP, that's going to be the truth. But what about now? That's in the aggregate. But what about in the per capita? Shouldn't we be thinking differently?
Americans get money.
Not get all caught up in, oh, they're communist Chinese and all. Come on. It's all about what kind of economy can you create and how creative you can be with that economy. And by the way, the jobs of the future, you mentioned AI, didn't you? Try to do AI without a master's degree or a PhD. Try to get a job in AI without those kind of certifications. We have robots now, literally making cars. Why does Japan beat us in the car industry? They were the first to automate. They were the first one to use robots to put this whole chassis together and everything else. And by the way, their cars lasted longer because everything was done with more precision. Right? By the way, what's the #1 skill for an auto mechanic? Now you're doing it the old-fashioned way, right? Which is really cool. This is why we're all so jealous, right? But if you want to be a mechanic today working at any shop, you got to know that computer data coming out of the computers of all of these automated vehicles. And it's even more so with electric vehicles, right? And this requires degrees. So what do we do with our labor shortage? Immigrate, automate, whatever. How about this? Why don't we do what Kuwait does and give every citizen $100,000 a year as a base wage and reduce the 40-hour work week to 20 hours a week and let robots do the work. That's all for another day. That's just stuff to get you thinking about it. Sadly, we can't finish this discussion today. We need to consider, your future needs to be considered with a little bit more time than we have today. So let's go ahead now and look at this, because here's the point. Americans do not care about foreign policy. What big thing happened yesterday that's an historic thing in American history? One of the biggest announcements in 20 years.
Are we out of the Middle East finally?
Not the Middle East,
Oh, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan after 20 years. Now, by the way, this is the only class so far where anybody's even had a little chirp of a heartbeat about what this issue is. When I look at the newscast from last night, it wasn't even the lead story. They're talking about Minneapolis, they're talking about all these kinds of things, whatever, because Americans just don't care. But Biden will be remembered as a president who actually ended a war after 3 former presidents couldn't do it or wouldn't do it. Here's the truth. It's easy to go to war. Just ask how easy it was for him to take America to Afghanistan after the 9/11 attack 20 years ago. One president, he punted the ending of it. The next president punted, the next president punted, and it punted right into Obama's hands. And Obama said, I am not leaving this to the next president. And he's pulling troops out on the 9/11 anniversary this year. let's go ahead and listen to the announcement, right? This is history slapping us in the face. So we kind of have to do a little bit of a different lecture here.
Begins our series, American Extremism, a new warning about the risks for the entire country. President Biden today declaring it's time for American troops to come home as he announced all U.S. forces will soon be out of Afghanistan, saying the events of 9/11 20 years ago cannot explain why we should remain here in 2021. Here's Peter Alexander.
America's commander-in-chief tonight paying his respects to fallen U.S. troops from Iraq and Afghanistan at Arlington National Cemetery. Earlier, President Biden declaring America's longest war will come to an end by September 11th, speaking in the same room where President Bush first announced military action in Afghanistan.
We went to Afghanistan because of a horrific attack that happened 20 years ago. That cannot explain why we should remain there in 2021.
The withdrawal of more than 2,500 service members from Afghanistan to begin within weeks, but missing the May 1st deadline set by former President Trump. President Biden saying America's goals have been achieved.
Bin Laden is dead and Al-Qaeda is degraded in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And it's time to end the forever war.
The president's move drawing bipartisan praise, but also criticism.
Al-Qaeda and ISIS are going to come back. He's paving the way for another 9/11.
President Biden's own CIA director today acknowledging there's a, quote, significant risk that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups will try to rebuild once the U.S. and its allies leave. Still, for the military, it marks the end of an era. More than 2,300 U.S. troops dead.
I didn't realize it was that high. I usually try to track things like this, and I know that, like I said, I mean, not everybody is even listening to it right now. It's not, we don't care in this country, but we should care about that. And this is as many as in the Iraq War. And I'm a little stunned it's that high. We've had students who graduated from this school serve in Afghanistan. Some of the soldiers serving there today weren't even born when the conflict started. If you're an airman right now, 19, 20 years old, you weren't even born when it happened.
And the war lasting so long that multiple generations served.
I went and served my country so in this theater so that my son wouldn't have to.
But eventually Master Sergeant Trevor DeBoer's son, Specialist Peyton Sluss, would serve there too.
It was too long to be there. It's something we should definitely improve on so we don't have 20-year wars down the road.
That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is one of those events. And look, the deal is, it's not going to end in a pretty way. The problem with Afghanistan and the problem with Iraq and the problem with all of our wars is the American people really don't tune in to what's going on. I'm going to jump back to a lecture here and I'm going to skip around a little bit. So I apologize for that, but I had to go to this in a hurry because this just happened. Biden will be remembered as the president who ended the forever war. That will be a big thing. By the way, I failed to mention one more thing about the economy. His plan on the infrastructure, sorry, I forgot to put this in context, but let's just jump back and then I'll come back to the story. This 2.2 trillion to fix the infrastructure in America, right? Huge support. Modernizing the highways, roads, and streets among the GOP, Republicans, 71%, Democrats, 86%, Independents, 69%. Improving caregiving for older disabled people. By the way, we're talking about jobs. That's a labor-intensive job. It doesn't pay enough. It should pay a lot more. But a lot of old people now need a lot of care, a lot of people helping, this kind of thing. To make that better, 64%, 86%, 72%. Boosting medical manufacturing so we don't get caught off guard and we're able to make our own vaccines when we need to in a hurry, and other pharmaceuticals too, because most of them we buy from China and India. Boosting medical manufacturing, 51% approval, 82%, 58%. Replacing lead, water, and pipes. Some of our cities were built a long time ago with pipes they thought were safe, but they corrode over time and put lead into the water, like in Flint, Michigan. And all that has to be torn up and they have to be replaced with modern pipes. And this is a real problem. We have kids drinking lead right now. Bad news. Okay, 60%, 85%, 69%. If you're above 50%, it's like a home run, right? These are numbers that are, nobody can believe these numbers from the poll last night. Building and improving schools, 62%, 87%, 63%. Massive approval. Modernizing veterans hospitals. You know, the socialist part of our healthcare system, where we actually do build the hospitals, hire the doctors, and take care of our veterans. We're going to improve that, and we should. My son, veteran, my dad, veteran, my dad, World War II, took advantage of the Veterans Administration hospital system until the end of his life. My brother-in-law, Korean vet, he died in a hospice center up in Salt Lake where my daughter-in-law actually worked. And sadly up there where she worked, she knows 12 veterans that lost their lives to COVID in that one facility. So for all of us, this is really real. And that is a welcome thing. The facility hospice care for older veterans in St. George is epically wonderful. It's worth every dime we pay as taxpayers to keep those soldiers in their old age. Anyway, that was just a thing I forgot to do, but I wanted to put that out before we get to this part here. Okay, so now let's talk about how we got into this Afghanistan war in the first place. This is a complicated story, and that's the other problem. The economy is a simple story to understand. You either have a job or you don't. You either get a pay raise or you don't, right? And so, you know, this is what Americans live. Americans live for the great American dream to become rich, whatever. Those roofers, you know, doing that job up there, they're not doing it for free. They're doing it because it's good money. And they can make a good living doing it, right? And they can move all over the country and do that job too. They're not limited to one place, right? They can go wherever the highest bidder wants to hire them. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, Americans don't have the patience to even sit down and listen to a simple story. This is only going to go 20 minutes, and I'll bet you, like last period, I'll lose half the class.
This is interesting. I mean,
Just lack of interest. It's like, who cares, right? Imagine if you're in a college class where you're actually going to have a question on a study guide, and you can't keep people interested. Imagine what it's like for everybody else. Because it's complicated. Because it starts way back in 622. In 622, Islam explodes across the earth, becomes the fastest growing world religion in history. In 100 years, they were from Spain all the way into India. I mean, it's just Indonesia even. Okay, now here's the deal though. Within less than 50 years after its founding, they had a succession crisis. Muhammad died. The first three leaders, everybody kind of agreed they should be the leaders, but on the fourth one, the last person who was actually with Muhammad during his lifetime, Ali, was destined to assume leadership for a while. He was one of four caliphs, they called him. He got challenged by a leader in Baghdad, a king, if you will. And they fought a big civil war there. And Ali lost. His son Hussein also lost a battle. So Hussein and Ali become heroes among the group that wanted this succession to be in that family. And as a result of this group here in dark green, can you see that? Became a breakoff of Islam called Shia Islam. They're the Shiites. Now, well, the rest of the Islamic world became Sunni. The greater group, the Sunni, the smaller group, the Shia, but notice how concentrated they are in a little patch in Afghanistan, in the country of current day Iran, and you look like the little thumb here in this country called Iraq. Now there's other pockets of them here, and there's pockets of them here, but the main majority is in this area right here. Especially pay attention to Afghanistan, because this is a group right here, but the majority of this is Sunni. Sunni and Shia Muslim, there was a big split. So now let's kind of focus in on Iran a little bit, right? Iran, it's an interesting story with Iran. Iran was a strong American ally in World War II. How do you think we shipped goods and equipment into the Soviet Union to help the Soviet Union fight off the Nazis? A lot of it came through Iran and so on. So they remained an ally. And then when the Cold War started, and all of this area up here is the Soviet Union, we built them in as a building block of our containment policy to keep the communist threat from expanding. And we gave them military supplies and all this kind of stuff, and they were a great ally of ours, right? So that's, oh, by the way, there's a lot of oil here too. So British oil companies, American oil companies were building, all sorts of facilities here and pulling the oil out of that country. But it's a little more complex than that, because here's the thing, while Iran was a great ally for a long time, there's other things happening in the Middle East. There was another more extreme version of Sunni Islam. Now look at the Shiites spread out here. See this correct group right here? Syria. Why is it in civil war right now? Been in civil war for about 15 years. This group here of Shia Muslims dominate the rest of the country. They're the minority, but they're dominating the majority. See, this is going to create a problem. In Iraq, it's the same thing. This group right here are the minority, but this is the majority of the population, and they're different. They consider each other to be heretics. I mean, the belief system is, I always ask my Muslim students to correct me if I'm wrong, but the beliefs, they celebrate Ramadan. They have the same pillars. They do their prayers just slightly differently. I mean, but it's like Christianity. Roman Catholic Church broke away from what? The Protestant churches. They broke away in 1500, and they fought a 30 years war against each other, Protestant versus Catholic. Now, here's the deal. Another group sprung up, and they're called Wahhabite. And this is where it really gets complicated, because the Wahhabites is an extreme version of Sunni Islam that started with one preacher here, but found root in Saudi Arabia, the holy country, where you have Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, where everybody goes on pilgrimage, the Hajj, including Shia and Sunni. They all go on the same Hajj. Migration. Go visit. It's part of your religious obligation. So this country of Saudi Arabia, where the majority, it's a kingdom, a theocracy rather, they have this extremist group. And one kid by the name of Osama bin Laden gets brought into this group. He adopts it, and he is a rich billionaire's son. His father is the largest contractor in all of Saudi Arabia, and trust me, they do a lot of building there. And part of that fortune went to this son, and he then became almost a monk with a fortune and converts to this Wahhabism. His name's Osama what? Bin Laden. I told you it was a complicated story. Let's get back to Iran. Iran was our ally against Soviet Union during the early part of the Cold War. But then, Americans like we are, and the British, of course, were there too. And we're saying, hey, you guys ought to do more with democracy, right? You're a monarchy, I get it. But let's do some democracy. So they did. They actually had an election, and they elected a prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And Mohammad Mossadegh, right, looks at the map and he goes, wait a minute. Yes, we can trade with the British. Yes, we can trade with the Americans. But along the northern border, the Soviet Union, they need oil. They want money. Why not trade with this country right across? And they started to discuss opportunities with the Soviet Union. They kind of wanted to be neutral, if you will. The British MI6 was not going to stand for it. The American CIA wasn't going to stand for it. And we engineered a coup d'etat. Coups are easy.
Something that we had wanted to have.
Yes. So, yes. And so what happened, the hypocrisy here, literally started a riot in the streets, blamed it on Mossadegh, and we rushed in and got the Shah back in power. He's the king. The problem with the Shah is he's kind of this brutal dictator type who's not really nice to his own people. And it was all about preserving the oil, and feared Mossadegh was becoming too close with the Soviet Union. So it was part of our Cold War strategy. This would backfire in a big way. Sometimes things you do today have long-term consequences. Ayatollah Khomeini in 1953 was a religious leader. He objected to this whole thing, and he got exiled by the Shah, and he was thrown into France. But from France, he worked through the mosques of Iran, and over time built all this support for what later would happen in 1979, the overthrow of the Shah in the Iranian revolutions. Coups are easy. Revolutions are hard. But they pulled it off. And so now all of a sudden, we have our old ally is now hates us. They hate the British even more, which is interesting. But by the same token, we went from friends to ally in a day. I mean, from allies to enemies in a day. And Then a bunch of their students go a little crazy one day.
Go.
They were, you know, they bought into all the rhetoric, whatever. I'm just guessing, but I'm pretty sure the religious leaders who are now running the country, this theocracy of Iran, were not very happy that this happened. But when it did, they used it to their advantage. A bunch of students overran the American embassy, captured 54 hostages, and they were held hostages for 444 days during the last years of the presidency of Jimmy Carter. The Marines didn't fire. They just felt like it would have been not the right thing to do. And as a result, they all got captured. Now, here's what's going on. Well, and I got to praise your President Carter. While he's working the last of his presidency to get the hostages released, other people are seeing this situation to their advantage. I'm going to go back to the map. Iraq, seeing that this place was in revolution and it was no longer an ally and protected by the United States, they become an ally of the United States. But then they do something really crazy. They contest the border between Iran and Iraq. They want to take the oil in this part of Iran. So they built the fourth largest army in the world at the time and invaded. Now the Iranians shocked them because not only did they fight, but they fought ferociously, losing 1 million men to the Iraqi army. Waves of people. The Iraqis using American equipment, it was at best a stalemate, and it went on for years. And Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq that started this whole mess, even went so far as to use chemical weapons against the Iranians. Oh, by the way, he'd already used them against his own people up here, a minority group called the Kurds. Chemical weapons, which were totally banned after World War I. And yet he's doing this, and he still can't win. He doesn't capture any territory, and he's borrowed lots of money from all over the Middle East to fight his war. He wasn't producing enough oil of his own to pay his debts. So he then decides to do something really pretty crazy. And then during all of this right here, we have this war. This is an American Chinook helicopter that was used in Vietnam that we gave to them to use in this fight. So the Iranians hate us even more now because we took the Iraqi side against them in this war that would last from 80 to 88. A lot going on in the 80s. Now, the problem for Saddam Hussein is he's from a minority group here. This is where he's from. And he's dominating the Shia, who have a lot more religious interests with the Iranians. In fact, there's sacred sites here that the Iranians want to travel to. It's much more complicated than it appears on the map. This group up here is called the Kurds, and he was taking over Kurdish land to steal oil in those areas from the Kurds. Now, what happens next is this. In the vacuum that was created by this war that happened in the revolution in Iran, the Soviet Union, we were distracted with Iraq, we were distracted with other things. So they decide to take advantage of the situation and invade this country called, and I'll go back to the map again because it's easier to see from the map, called Afghanistan, which is all along their border. They got a long border there. They just drove their tanks. Remember, they have the best land army in the world at that time. And they stormed it. And this country is 90% illiterate. It's high in the mountains. They're very, very religious people. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union thinks they can storm into there, take it over, grab the natural resources, make it part of the Soviet Union. Oh, by the way, in the Soviet Union, they didn't allow you your freedom of religion. So they're going to dismantle Islam. Like the Chinese are trying to do with the Uyghurs right now. How is this going to go over among this mountain people who the only thing they really know is their faith?
They're gonna go crazy.
They did. And they fought like you wouldn't believe. Let's jump ahead. Group called the Mujahideen, freedom fighters, rose up to fight the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had all this equipment, they had all the advantages, but they set up a Marxist, non-religious government in the center of that city, in the center of the country, the capital city. And guess what? After 8 years, 120,000 troops. We have a fraction of that there. 120,000 troops. They killed 1 million people. And 5 million people were pushed into refugee status. I think I can do it from this map. No, I need a better map. Let me go back to another map and I'll show you how this works. So what happens is 5 million people fled into Pakistan. Now they're refugees and they're living in these refugee camps. So a group of teachers called the Taliban emerged. Understand the Taliban is different than Al-Qaeda. That's the key thing here. Al-Qaeda will be a terrorist group organized by Osama bin Laden, who is from Saudi Arabia. The Taliban were these people living here, and they set up schools to indoctrinate young men. Girls were not allowed education. They are really ancient in terms of their practices here. And when the war ends and the Soviet Union pulls out, creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, you had a bunch of warlords take over, kind of like Myanmar. The #1 product produced in Afghanistan was opium for the drug trade. That's the kind of people we're talking about here. These religious folks now are really ticked off about that, so they invade their own country. And they kick out the warlords, except for a few up in here. And they take over the country and they put it under a very different set of rules. It became, I think, the most severe theocracy that we've seen in a long time. And I'm going to jump ahead. Now, while this is going on, I got to jump to this guy. Osama bin Laden used his fortune to bring a bunch of foreign fighters from Saudi Arabia and other countries to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. He became a hero in the Middle East, kind of like a Robin Hood character, and lived in caves, did the whole thing. And when the Soviet Union left, guess what? They spent so much money that is one of the reasons why their economy collapsed and the Soviet Union ceased to exist 4 years later. He accepts total credit for that. Oh, by the way, while he was fighting, the CIA managed to slip him some weapons, as we did the Mujahideen, as we did the Taliban, weapons to use against the Soviets, just like the Soviet Union did to us in Vietnam. It's payback time. This is literally, Afghanistan is the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It didn't work, cost him dearly. And 4 years later, they no longer exist. And he takes credit, Osama bin Laden, for destroying the great Satan of the Soviet Union, that godless country that tried to take over Afghanistan. Oh boy, there's more things that happened during this time frame that we don't have time for today. But here is the American Secretary of Defense meeting with Osama bin Laden, the Iraqi leader, during this Iraq war that's going on. Meanwhile, there's a war going on in Afghanistan with the Soviet Union. But then Saddam Hussein does something really, really crazy. Again, it's probably best if I go back to another map. He owed people money here and everywhere. Needed to get the money back. But also, too, how do you get it? This oil-rich country is called Kuwait. By the way, if you're a Kuwaiti citizen, they give you something like $100,000 a year just because you're a citizen. They haul in workers from all over the world to do the work there. They make so much money on oil. I think per person, they're the richest people on the planet, per citizen. Nevertheless, he takes this country over. He's got the 4th largest army in the world, battle tested against the Iranians. He takes us over in a day. But the road now to the capital of Saudi Arabia is right there. And everybody feared that he would then take over Saudi Arabia, which meant he would control the Holy Land of Mecca and Medina, and that could not be allowed to happen. So as a result, the United States organized an operation under George H.W. Bush. The Bush, you know, his father back in '91. The first was Operation Desert Shield to protect Saudi Arabia from being attacked. We built a military base there. And most of American soldiers are Christian. Osama bin Laden is ticked off. He's saying you can't have infidels guarding a sacred country. He gets really mad at that. But we then launched Operation Desert Storm, which is one of the greatest achievements ever in American military history. Here's Bush right here meeting the troops. It was a coordinated attack by our allies from NATO, countries from all over the Middle East. We hit this place hard. In 3 days, we completely destroyed the entire Iraqi military in 3 days. Saddam Hussein was pushed all the way back into his capital city in Baghdad, and that war was won. More to that story that we don't have time for, but Osama bin Laden is fuming now, and he feels that he's destroyed the one great Satan. Now let's go after the other. And so he reconstitutes Al-Qaeda, and they go to Afghanistan and ask the Taliban to allow them training camps in that country. And he pays them the Taliban, and they're short on cash, he pays them to organize these training camps. Out of those training camps will be the terrorists that will go to Germany and plan this attack, come to the United States, train in those facilities that train people to fly. You know, you go to flight school and it's all simulations. We have one right here at UVU, by the way. It's a great school. You want to learn to fly, go to UVU, right? Point is, then they launched the attack. And on the attack of the 19 hijackers, I think 18 of them were from Saudi Arabia. They were not from Afghanistan. They were not Taliban. They were Saudis, Sunni Muslims, Wahhabi extremists from Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, if you're now a woman, for example, living in this new republic here of Afghanistan, life has become very difficult. Women have to wear the burqa. They can only see out of a little film screen there. They have to be fully clothed. If your ankles appear in public, you can be beaten in the street, and many were. No schooling, no music, no iPad, no cell phone. All you get is a few religious books, do the work at home. You can't even leave the home to go shopping for food without a male escort. This is a really ancient kind of interpretation of Islam. And this Taliban regime then is in charge, and there's Mullah Omar, and he's getting some funding from Osama bin Laden, who's setting up these training camps. And then out of that training camps, we get several attacks. The first one came when out in Yemen, which is fighting a civil war right now, Shia and Sunni, right? They attacked one of our warships, the USS Cole, killed 8 sailors. Then a little while later, 4 embassies in Africa were all hit at the same time by Al-Qaeda terrorists. Remember, these are not Afghans, they're not from they're not Taliban, these are Al-Qaeda, mostly from Saudi Arabia. Then they hit the trade centers and the Pentagon on 9/11.
And that really struck America, right?
That's right. So
Really
now,
inflamed America.
George Bush knew exactly where the terrorist camps were. He announced we're going, and he then gave the Taliban leader, Omar, what's his name? Yeah, Mullah Omar, gave him an ultimatum. Help us get the terrorists, turn over Osama bin Laden, let us come in and take over those camps, or you're the friend of my enemy is my enemy. They chose Osama bin Laden. That proved to be a mistake, that threat, because what happens now is the Pashtun, the Taliban people, now not all everybody is in that. There's some Sunni people who are being persecuted, by the way. Anyway, long story short, these people have never been conquered since Alexander the Great. They repelled the British Empire in the 1800s. They repelled the Soviet Empire in the 1980s, and they are going to come out every spring and fight you no matter what. They will not stand for you being there. Here's Bagram Air Force Base, the biggest Air Force base in the world for a while there. And this is where we've been conducting operations. From this base, we did manage to find Osama bin Laden hiding in Pakistan next door. And President Obama sent in SEAL Team 6, and they ended that. But we occupied the country, not alone, with our NATO allies, because NATO has a charter. So it's an attack on one is an attack on all. And we got attacked on 9/11. So all the European countries, the British, the French, we're talking about the Italians, the Germans, the Polish, they were all there here too fighting. But after 20 years, we've not been able to control the country. We set up, there's a government set up in this capital of Kabul, but guess what's going to happen now that we leave? By the way, this is the escape route of Osama bin Laden. He was hiding out here in Pakistan, and later we found him. Here's what's going to happen next. The United States leaves. There'll be another civil war. They have been fighting, the Taliban have been fighting they've been fighting amongst themselves in Afghanistan since 1980, nonstop. There are people in their 50s that know nothing but war. And they're going to topple this government just like they did when the Soviets were there. And it's going to be 20 years will have gone by and nothing will have changed. I wish I had a happy ending to this. My question for you is simple. Do you think we should leave or should we stay? And that is going to be a great question. I'm going to have you separate Al-Qaeda from the Taliban Now that Al-Qaeda has been destroyed, 20 years later, simple question in your study guide. What do you think we should do? For those of you that listened, I think you've got enough information to work with, right? But Americans don't care about this kind of stuff, guys. The only thing we care about is, hey, what's our food prices doing? And am I going to get my Chick-fil-A sandwich today? Which, by the way, sounds like a great place for me to eat. So maybe that's where I'll end up today. All right, you guys, this class really has its act together, right? You guys really got it going. I see it in your writing. I see it in your answers. Keep it up. Keep it up. Everybody in this class can earn an A. By the way, good news here. 26 people are completely done now. 24 are nearly done. Only 12 have not yet submitted something. So when's the last day you can submit to get my help on this paper? Tomorrow night at midnight. I will help anybody that can get it in by tomorrow night at midnight. Give me something to work with, something I can suggest, and give you some ideas and whatever. I think I got yours, Heidi. I got yours done last night, right? You were doing great. But what one thing did you do that we need to correct? I mean, you did great. That first essay was super. The second one, though, what did you do? The first introduction was the same, was so similar that I need you to just write a new introduction, but the rest of the essay takes care of itself. So you're on a roll. You keep it up, Heidi. You're going to get there.